Okay, so the role of diet is changing. At one time, it was looked upon as just an adjunct or a side treatment, not taking the limelight. But what we know today, as Dr. Usha said, that right from the etiology to how it modulates the disease and the risk of complications, in all of that, diet has a role. And what is very attractive about diets is that it can be done on an everyday basis. It's low cost, easy to modify, and few side effects. So that is why the focus on diet, and I'm so happy that this program is there and given the importance to diet. How does diet work? Maybe I will not talk so much about it because Dr. Usha has already mentioned that the dietary components act in many different ways. But I think the most important way, or what is occupying the limelight, is the way it alters the microbiota or the microbial structure and function. And through that, the immune activity, also the mucosal permeability is affected by diet and the immune response through the dietary components. So in many ways, the diet works to either increase the risk or decrease it. So we'll just look at that. This is a study which I like to show. It's not very recent, about 10 years old. But here the impact of diet in shaping the gut microbiota was revealed very clearly in these different children from different parts of the world, in Europe and rural Africa. And what was really, this was one of the studies that started showing that how diet has an impact on gut microbiota. And the lesson that was learned here, and many studies then replicated it, that diet had a dominant role over all the other variables that were studied, and this altered the gut microbiota the most. Which is why there's this huge body of research going on in the last 10 years where the gut microbiota is being studied, and its links to immunity is definitely, and also mental health now. I think that is the focus. But right now we're talking about the gut and how it affects the risk of IBD and how it affects the treatment. Currently, there are about 25 diseases that have been linked to the gut microbiota imbalance, and IBD is one of them. And what we know, that there is definite dysbiosis seen in IBD, and what we know that in IBD, actinobacteria and proteobacteria, the ones that are associated with the bad kind of disease, is definitely increased in numbers, and the good ones, the Firmicutes and the Bacteroidetes, are reduced. So we know that diet and microbiota are connected. So here we start focusing on what to do in the diet. Like Dr. Usha mentioned, the various diets. So when you look at these diets, you are obviously confused. Which diet do I choose? Do I choose the Mediterranean diet, low FODMAP? And it can be a little overwhelming as to which one would be the right one for my patient. So personalized nutrition, personalized medicine, all of that is making a definite impact. And we know that one size does not fit all, and particularly so in the case of IBD. So we cannot say that this one particular diet scores over the others, and this will work better for all patients. So each one of us working in this field have to work on an individualized plan for each of the patients. So my first do is customize your diet. And this you can only customize after you understand the disease severity, the extent and the duration of the disease. You see whether the patient is a child or adult, whether it's which form of IBD, and whether it's in the active stage or is it in remission, whether there's a stricture or no stricture. And if the patient is well nourished, because you do a nutritional assessment. The second do very important. You need to track and record what's happening to your patient's diet. And the AIIMS team has come out with an app which is getting very popular, the IBD NutriCare app, and every day I know that they are working to improve it, and it's getting easier to use. So that's very helpful. But those who are not into using apps, they can just journal, and journaling is important because it helps to identify the troublemakers in the diet, and you exclude only the troublemakers. You don't want to exclude more than that. So you pay attention and you see how your body responds, and the common troublesome foods have already been discussed by Dr. Usha. So we all know the common ones, but everybody is different. You need to identify what it is for you. Another do for IBD diets is the learning the art and the science of substitution. And although we know that we don't have to restrict milk unless the patient is intolerant to it, but very often we find that patients complain of lactose intolerance. In that case, we tell them to have low lactose products like paneer and dahi, but just in case they do not tolerate that as well, you have other options. And with plant-based diet becoming popular, you have more and more of these options coming in. Similarly, if you have to substitute wheat because of gluten intolerance, you have very many millets. I know ragi in the south is very popular. It's very rich in calcium and iron, so it's one of the popular things that can be used as a substitute. Substituting alcohol, I know this is a difficult one when you have to substitute alcohol, but fermented drinks are good. You have the kanji, buttermilk, and red wine also in some amounts are allowed. We are a carb-loving country and we love our carbs, but sarcopenia is common, so we have to think about protein in every meal. You cannot let any meal be without a good dose of protein, and you can choose from any of these products, although the patients might be a little skeptical about using seeds or using nuts, but you can make them into nut butter, you can soak them, you can powder them, you can use sesame seeds which are calcium rich, you can use them as a powder in almost all foods and they go well with that. Lentils, if they are soaked overnight, cooked well, do not pose a problem. And egg and fish, of course, are good protein sources. So you cannot stop thinking about protein at any meal. So whether it's a snack or whether it is something that goes in between meals, think protein. Different kinds of fats are there, and the one that you need to focus on is N3 fatty acids, because our diets tend to be skewed in favor of N6 fatty acids. So you need to think about those sources which have N3 fatty acids, and I have listed some of them. The fatty fish that we have in many of the coastal regions that we can get, they're easily available. These fatty fish are good sources. And of course, in the oils, Dr. Usha mentioned that mustard oil was pro-inflammatory, but it has N3 fatty acids, which is anti-inflammatory. So it sort of evens out, and we need good sources of fatty acids. So we recommend mustard, soya, canola, which have N3 fatty acids. And if they don't want to use any of these oils, we tell them to use an oil which has a good balance. Which does not have too much of N6. So that is the strategy that one can use to make sure that you get enough N3. Once you detect and you find that there is nutrient deficiency, you need to give a supplement. It could be an oral nutrition supplement, and the good part is the polymeric formulas are just as good as the elemental one in efficiency, so you don't have to give those bad tasting ones, and patients are more compliant in taking that. Of all the nutrient deficiencies, vitamin D and zinc are the ones that one should focus on because they alter the disease course. So you cannot let these deficiencies linger, and you need to make sure that they are covered. About probiotics, there is a little bit of conflict or not very too much clarity about probiotics because the different guidelines recommend different things. So what we generally try and do is, of course, we don't give probiotics in Crohn's disease because there's no evidence for that. But in ulcerative colitis, we can add probiotic foods. I'm not talking about supplement. There are foods which have probiotics added to them, which can be part of the healthy diet, which every healthy person as well as somebody who has ulcerative colitis can add to the diet. And fermented foods are very good. They don't have the evidence as probiotic foods have because they have that body of research backing it. Fermented foods have been around for a long time. We know that they are good for health and they should be included because they may not have the dose of the bacteria in it, the specified dose, but it's definitely something that keeps the gut healthy. The other, before I start with the don'ts, I think the first important don't, which is a big problem in IBD, is that patients tend to be overly restrictive and they try and cut down. They're so scared of eating things that they try and cut down one thing after another, thinking that that will give them relief. But your job as a dietitian would be to find out the trigger and just restrict that, because we don't want the gut microbiota to disappear, which is happening with processed foods. So as a dietitian, I think we have been thinking about our roles, and our earlier role was to cut back and tell people what not to eat. But I think our role should be changing and we should be telling people what you can add to the diet, which is healthy. And believe me, it's a much easier thing to do, telling people what you can add, because telling people not to have something can be a problem. And this was a study which was interesting, that when you added 30 different types of plant-based foods and compared them to a group which ate only 10 different types, the one which had the 30 different types had better gut health, and this better gut health means better gut bacteria, and this is a good marker for health. So the diversity on the plate shows up in the gut and in terms of the gut microbiota. So more diverse the diet and more of plant foods, the diversity improves on the plate and in the gut. Not to do, one of the things is not too much of saturated fat. And again, this was mentioned in the earlier presentation, that we don't want to increase the population of the microorganisms that increase inflammation. So in that case, we have to keep the saturated fat low and keep the N6 PUFA low. So not too much of corn, curry oils, which have too much of N6 PUFA. And this is backed by evidence. In ulcerative colitis, high saturated fat was associated with the risk of more of problems. And in Crohn's disease as well, it improves when you have a high ratio of N3 as opposed to N6, then it improves the remission rates. FODMAP diets have been known to reduce the symptoms, but it does not mean that you have to be on a FODMAP diet, low FODMAP diet forever. As the tolerance increases, you can add FODMAPs back into the diet, because these are all sources of prebiotic fibers. The gut microbiota need these prebiotic fibers, and that is how the good bacteria will flourish. So you need them. Don't be on a low FODMAP diet for long periods of time, and you should think about how to get them back into the diet. And there are methods to reduce the FODMAPs. And I like to give this example of how tofu, which is firm, has lower FODMAPs as opposed to the silken and the soft tofu, because when you press it and remove the water, the FODMAPs decrease. Don't exclude all fibers. Even during a flare, the soluble fiber is good and needs to be there, because it strengthens the mucosal barrier, and it is something that is needed for good immune function. So don't exclude all fiber even during a flare. Some more don'ts which were covered by Dr. Usha, and this was sugars and sugary foods. Does not mean that a patient cannot have any sugar, but anything in excess, maybe more than 3 to 4 teaspoons in a day, will definitely reduce diversity of the microbiota, the processed meats, emulsifiers and maltodextrins, which we find in ultra-processed foods. And you can see this is one of the foods which has maltodextrin, it has emulsifiers. So these are the ultra-processed foods with many of these agents which are just there to process the food, and alcohol. So these are some more of the don'ts. Gluten, just a minute or two about gluten, because diet in IBD without talking about gluten would not be complete. Don't have to exclude it. There's no evidence to exclude it as a blanket statement that all patients of IBD will benefit from reducing or cutting out gluten. But what you can do is give alternatives if there are symptoms. But the thing is, you first need to document whether there is a need for it. So the diet rules are simple. You have to cut down on processed food, eat more of the whole foods. Diversity is important. Meal frequency, instead of having very large meals, just 3 meals, make it smaller meals, 6 meals. Spices, we tell patients to have turmeric instead of giving them the curcumin. Turmeric have more of the bioactive ingredients in it. So turmeric 5 grams, which comes easily in the Indian diet. Then fluids with lots of potassium, like coconut water and kokum, can be part of the healthy diet. Fermented foods which are fermented, they may not have the bacteria present at the time that you eat it, but if they are fermented, they have benefit, they are better absorbed by the body. So instead of ultra-processed food, the fermented foods are great. And the dark colored fruits and vegetables, preserve the colors because they have the bioactive ingredients in them. Don't destroy it by overcooking. Sometimes you may need to do it to so make the texture a little better, but overcooking at high temperatures should be avoided. So I'm going to leave you with some more food for thought, and I'm waiting to listen to the other lectures and the panel discussion. What I find something that is paradoxical is that emulsifiers and maltodextrins are implicated in the pathogenesis of IBD, yet many of the formulas contain them. And what I've noticed that now there are new formulas coming in, especially for IBD, which do not have these, but up until now, all the success that we have got, even with EEN, have been with these formulas which had emulsifiers and maltodextrins. And we know that over a period of time, if we give exclusive enteral nutrition, they can reduce microbial diversity, but it works because probably it's just working for 8 to 12 weeks that we give them, and eventually when they go into remission, we get back to a normal diet. So thank you so much for your patient listening, and thank you, Rupa, once again.